I would like to welcome here Professor Radka Vildová, who is the Deputy Minister for Research at the Ministry of Education in the Czech Republic. Dr. Heinrichsen, who is the Deputy Ambassador and Head of Mission at the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany here in Prague. And last but not least, Dr. Tomáš Nigrin, who is the Director of our own Institute of International Studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences at Charles University. So please, floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for my floor at this moment. I am Radka Vildová, Deputy Minister for Higher Education and Research and Innovation in the Czech Republic. I'm absolutely new in the position. My position is 113 days only, but still I try to work as hard as it is possible. So thank you for inviting me for this occasion. And I am very grateful to be here together with you because the topic of populism and climate change is not only important, this is a very big advantage, and it is a very big, serious point to discuss at the beginning of the Czech presidency of Council or Board of European Council. So this is very important, and this is a big challenge. We have the advantage because we are talking it a little bit early than the presidency will start. And what I know about this conference, it is the seventh in the last 7 years, as I understand. So this is very hard work to organize different topic on populism. And what is very important, I think, to discuss is populism in general view, because the more we have the information, the more we have the disinformation, disinterpretation, and the more we have populism. And populism complicates a lot of very serious debate. Debate about the climate change, but we see at this moment about the Ukraine war, where the populism and disinformation makes a very big problems for society. So I'm very glad that Dr. Maestrik and Institute for International Studies of the Faculty of Social Sciences is taking care about this a very important issue, and I am looking forward for the results of this discussion. And because the topic is for this year populism and climate change, we are very close to say that we are at the beginning of a Czech presidency for the European institution. So thank you for inviting me, and good luck for this afternoon and the other days of the conference. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me here. I was already introduced, so I have to say right from the beginning, I'm not an expert in populism, nor I am an expert in climate, but I try to do my very best to convey you the German position that we have looking at these issues. You see that we are having a new government in Germany since the end of last year, and if you have followed the news, you will see that fighting climate change is one of the top priorities of the German government. And it's not just a priority of the Green Party. I really have to say this. This is a priority of all democratic parties in Germany, including, for example, the Christian Democrats that are in opposition. And it's a cross-cutting issues for all the ministries. In previous times, we had that the Ministry for the Environment was in charge of that. And then we had the Ministry for the Economy and the Business Sector. But now it's part of the agenda of each and every ministry. And from that you see how important this is. Having to do with populism, one thing we noted in the past is that populists have denied that there is man-made climate change. I think this is basically gone, at least here in Europe, maybe in the United States. There are still some people who don't believe it, but if we look at the facts, look outside. We're sitting outside, but the weather is fine, it's dry, it's getting warmer every year. So it's very difficult to deny the facts. And I believe if we have an open flank vis-a-vis the populists, it's not the fact that we do have climate change. It's very difficult to doubt it. But there are issues that populists might abuse about climate change. One aspect, for example, is that climate change will not come free of cost. We will have transformational costs. Prices will go up. Let's say for transportation, we see it at the gas station, for heating of your home. So people will complain who's going to pay for the green transformation. It's going to be the poor people. And who's going to profit from it? It's going to be the elite. It's going to be Brussels. And then you have the motive for the populists saying, you see, who made this green agenda? It's all the rich people who can afford it and who will suffer from it. It's the poor people who cannot afford it who have to pay the price. So this is why it's very important to counter all these populist approaches, that we have a strong social agenda accompanying the climate change transformation. The European Union has already foreseen for that with the Transformation Fund going along with that. And if I have the numbers right, it's 1.6 billion euros that alone the Czech Republic gets out of that fund to work as a buffer, to give social support for those people who will really have to shoulder the costs resulting from the green transformation. For some, the green transformation may even be more substantial. It's about the loss of jobs. Both of our countries have a huge car industry. And even if new jobs will be created and new qualified jobs in these industries, one effect will be, because it's easier to produce electric cars, that we will have less people working in these sectors. And so one argument that we may have here from populists, and at least we in Germany hear it, that the green transformation is a job killer. You know, it's bad for the people, it's taking away opportunities from people. And I would say nothing could be more away from the truth than that. Because if we look at Germany, we already missed out on a number of industrial revolutions, you know. For example, if I look at the computer industry, the software is made in the United States, the computers are produced in China. No role for Germany, but just one software company that is big enough to compete on a worldwide stage, which is SAP in Germany. Even if we have nowadays more chip manufacturing because we see onshoring again, getting back to Europe. But if I look at companies that really make the money, which is Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on, all American, there's not much left on the German side. So we have the conviction that we cannot drop out of the future industry that we expect there to be there and has to be there, which is an industry that produces the goods that we need to reduce energy consumption, that help us to do the green transition, that help to provide the solutions of the future. And both Germany and the Czech Republic, we live off products that we sell on the world market that are highly complicated, but that answer to needs people have. Today it's the cars, in future it will be climate-relevant technology. And if we don't want to lose this market, we have to have the green transformation. If we stick to the technologies we're having right now, we won't have a future. This is the lesson we learn from history, and this is what we hear from industry. So don't think that green transformation in Germany is driven by a government that has to convince industry. It's the opposite. It's the companies that come to us and say, if we don't change the way we produce, if we don't change the products that we want to sell on the world markets, we will go down the drain. So you must help us as a government to do that. You must have the right framework for that. We have to have the right laws for that. There's a big pressure from industry to do that. And this is something we have to explain to the people, that green transformation is not a job killer, but it's an enabler. It's an opportunity to create new jobs. And I think this is especially true for countries like Germany and Czechia that are highly industrialized. We are happy to have industry that helped us a lot to go through financial troubles when other countries had great difficulties. And I think Germany did well and the Czech Republic did well. But we can only continue to do so if we stick to that, if we have that industry. And then we have to produce future-oriented things. Beyond this, the war in Ukraine reminds us of the risks of energy dependency. I mean, we don't want to rely on countries that do not share our values and are not reliable suppliers. The green transformation gives us something that helps us to save energy, to produce renewable energy at home, and to become more self-reliant, more independent, more self-sufficient. In the past, what we have seen is that many populists tended to support Russia. I have to say, from my point of view, I find it very difficult to imagine that in future anybody would stand up in favor of Russia and say, look, Russia could be a reliable business partner on delivering energy. So I think for the time being, and from a German perspective, I think that's a battle lost for the populists to come up again with the Russia card saying we're better off if we go along with them. I think this is basically through. This is done with. But that does not mean that populism is not a challenge to democratic societies and institutions, as you said. It's not just climate change. Beyond that, it may be a return of the COVID pandemics. For example, what we have seen in Germany, that things that were quite normal over years. Yeah, thank you. Things that were quite normal over years, for example, getting vaccinated. There was an obligation to get vaccinated. They turned political, and it's very difficult. We even in Germany failed to have a legal obligation to get vaccinated against COVID, which we wanted to have, but it didn't pass through the Bundestag because it got politicized. We have to pay attention to it that this does not happen with green issues. If they get politicized, they may be stuck in parliament and nothing anymore happens. And of course, other things like the inflation, high energy prices already mentioned, natural catastrophes, these are all things that populists may exploit. As you mentioned, it's an easy thing. You may always find easy culprits, be it the elites, be it the European Union, be it migrants, Jews, Muslims, or whatsoever. So this is what I think why it's very important to have this conference here today. And as I try to outline, especially the green transformation contains many risks, risk of disinformation, risks for the living standard, for the profession of people, and one has to counter them, one has to inform about them, and one has to discuss what we can do to deliver solutions. Yeah? We have to find out what the problem is and to find responses. And if the conference can come up with that already, that would be a big, big step forward. So thank you all very much for your attention, and thank you for participating, and I wish you a very good conference.
Professor Vildová, Dr. Hinrichsen, distinguished guests, organizers. My name is Tomáš Negrin, and I would like to welcome you here in the name of the Institute of International Studies of the Faculty of Social Sciences of Charles University. This conference is now in its seventh year, and it developed into a very important and interesting international academic event. After 2 years of Corona and Zooming from our living rooms, I'm very glad that we can hear each other offline, because I think that these social meetings are really important for avoiding of populism and some false interpretations of development. I would like to express many thanks to the cooperation institutions, to Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung and to Goethe-Institute. Thank you very much for cooperating with our institute. I would like to express many thanks to our distinguished guests and to all of you, to the visitors of our conference, and I wish you a pleasant academic event and fruitful discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks, and now we can actually start with the main keynote of the afternoon session. Unfortunately, the keynote of Donatella Della Porta. Unfortunately, for some reasons, Donatella can't at the end join us today in person, but we have her online. So I will give floor to you in any second, and to the. Okay, so and we will manage hopefully to start the keynote online, which after 2 years of COVID we should be able to manage it. So please, if we are ready to connect.
I'm told I can start, so I want to apologize once again for not being here. This has been related with something maybe also connected with climate change, cable brand on the German railway system. But I hope the connection is working well, and please let me know if there are any problems. So what I plan to do today is to present some reflections that I hope can address the main concerns of this conference on the challenges and opportunities for progressive movements that the pandemic is bringing about. And in the challenges, I will put especially the development of an environment in which some elements of populism have developed. And on the opportunity side, though, I want to put some elements that also refer to, in particular, to the environmental movement in terms of the discursive opportunities that the pandemic brought about. I start with, oops, this is blocked. Yeah. I start with the general observation that the pandemic times has been a period of social movements, which doesn't mean only of social movements on the progressive sides, but it means a time in which contention in the streets has not been frozen, as political scientists, scholars, but also activists had expected, but rather it has been a time in which many different movements went into the streets, presenting challenges, but also opportunities for the development of progressive politics. So many research are ongoing on the characteristics of the progressive movements in these periods, including the potential for the environmental movements to connect and build alliances and coalitions with other movements. So this is a statement by one of the collective effort to depict what's going on the progressive sides. And the main opening line is quite indicative. The world is on fire with both fever and flame. And just after a few months of the lockdown, there was, in fact, a very fast development of protest. On the progressive side of the pictures, and something that I think is very much influential on the development of environmental politics, we have seen different types of mobilizations. We have seen innovative protests that have addressed very different type of concerns, that have connected the many crises that the health crisis has interacted with, from the climate crisis to crisis related with increasing social stress and intersectional inequalities. And on the progressive side, this has also been related with a lot of grassroots initiatives that have developed on what in previous waves of protest has been defined as the development of commons, that is the development of direct social actions that aims at offering help to people in need, but also practicing different forms of potential alternatives. And this has been particularly interesting when looking at the development of environmental groups, because what we have seen has been that, notwithstanding the challenges involved in the lockdowns, many groups have adapted to the new situations by using also social medias and different forms of encounter online, but they have also developed forms of offering natural products and of thinking about a different relationship with nature and also with consumptions. So various type of initiatives have been able, also on environmental issues, to cater a new constituencies and to get, say, in contact with a broader range of potential supporters. Also, what we have seen has been the development of a lot of effort put in alternative knowledge. It is also in trying to understand how the different crises are connected and how, in particular, the health crisis is to be considered as connected with different type of capitalist crises that have been singled out in the past, from the ones that clenched with the financial crisis of the beginning of the years 2010s to also the climate change and different crises related with increasing inequalities. Protesting has been ongoing. We are collecting information on the growing numbers of protest events. And on the progressive sides, what we have seen has been a strong connections, coalition buildings between environmental concerns. The pictures on the right down represents one of the global strikes for climate that happened in 2020 during the lockdown. But it connects also with concerns about public health, about democracy, about the type of effects that all these crises have on labor and on different type of social movements going on the progressive sides. This has also been related with the framing of a post-pandemic world, so the imaginations of a future in which frames and concerns, claims about public health, social inequalities, labor rights, violence on women have been also connected with environmental challenges. And this also happened during a moment in which various new concepts have been developed with the involvement of environmental movements that were active also in the past in rethinking how commons could be developed in new forms and how caring for nature and for the world is connected with the pandemic crisis as a health crisis. So this type of developments show the opportunities for progressive movement in emergency critical junctures. So in a moment of deep changes that challenge the everyday life of the individuals, but which also triggered in this part of the social movements, let's call them in the good part of the social movements, development of solidarity initiatives, sense of solidarity within broadly defined communities, the potential of the innovations in communication challenges, and the opening of discursive opportunities about our societies that visibly doesn't work, can be transformed in order to achieve aims of social justice and climate justice, which have been already connected in the development of the Fridays for Future movements, but have been more and more connected during the pandemic crisis. As an example of this type of movements, I want to take the Black Lives Matter protests that spread in several countries. I studied in particular the Italian case, exactly in the moment of the deeper pandemic crisis. In the summer of 2020, when many countries like my own were still in lockdown, we had in a range of few days the spreading at the local level of a huge amount of concerns and attention that was triggered by the assassinations of George Floyd in the United States, and triggered reflections on how racism and specific forms of inequalities were related with environmental changes, with the various forms, other forms of inequalities, with violence against women, with concerns for the rights of migrants. And this developed through the adoptions and the spreading of a new protest script that followed similar type of choreography in different countries. What the examples of the Black Lives Matter shows is the type of catalyzation of sentiments of solidarities that the pandemic brought about. The assassinations of Floyd was not the first. It came at the end, in that moment, of a long chain of assassinations by the police or by racists of Black people. But what the movement stressed, and I think it's relevant also when thinking about climate change, is the ways in which the pandemic has focused attention on injustice and has catalyzed reactions to them. So these are pictures of the Black Lives Matter in Florence activists concerned about the pandemic, so wearing facial masks, went into the streets and sat together to discuss how different concerns and different crises could be connected, and especially how citizens could intervene in these pictures. This happened in a way that I think is very relevant for thinking about the environmental movements, because it happens very much through a mobilization from below, from individuals or small groups that used social media as forms for mobilizing activists or simply citizens that had been shocked by the events and that were ready to meet physically in the squares that were just going to reopen. This is a path that Fridays for Future has testified being also very relevant for the development of the environmental movements and for interactions between the sort of individual protagonism of small groups of citizens sensitized to issues with the use of new innovative media of actions. One element that I want to point out from our research on the Italian case, but also stressed by research in other countries, is that forms of actions, as in the pictures that I have shown, were stressing protest and denunciations, but also prefigurations. So the images that we have of this protest, similarly to the images that we have on the environmental protest, are images of activists sitting down and in circles and discussing potential future. So there is an element of open challenges and indignations, but there is also a constructive element in thinking together about a different future. And when looking at the type of groups that participated in the Black Lives Matter protest, we see that, this is again the Italian case, but we see that the individual activists that I mentioned before were supported also by activists coming from the different social movements active in pre-pandemic and during pandemic time, from students' organization to LGBTQ groups, from feminists to the Fridays for Future and environmental organizations that were very fast in connecting climate change also to its racial effect and more in general to intersectional type of inequalities. So the trigger coming from the United States was recontextualized and helped bringing together different streams in the progressive movements by creating a momentum, by creating attention and resonance in the public opinion, in a public spheres that was characterized at the same time by activists that were closed by the lockdown and couldn't move, but also by a large attention at what was going on at the global level. So the message of the Black Lives Matter protest was a message that went through very different type of movements, including the environmental one, and can be synthesized by the slogan, the poster of one of the activists, which said, "Silence is violence." And in fact, also about the environment, one of the main functions of the social movements is in creating new alternative, subaltern, is the term that has been used by some scholars, public spheres, in which issues are discussed and solutions, potential solutions elaborated. What is also important about the Black Lives Matter is that it brought about different compositions, so it broadened the social basis for the movements that participated in it. This is also relevant for the environmental movements because the main innovations coming with the Fridays for Future or the Extinction Rebellion movements is the capacity of these mobilizations to attract the attentions of new social and generational groups. So the young people that participate in protest, in the case of the Black Lives Matter, the Black and racialized people bring in these movements new type of reflections and linking different specific concerns like climate change with broader social inequalities, help creating broader coalitions. Help that is in bridging the frames through, as an activist said, an intersectional approach in which the issues of racism is connected also with other sources of discriminations, other challenges. Environmental racism, which is also a connecting, a bridging frame between the environmental movement and the broadening reflection on intersectional inequalities. So in this protest, young people in this case also young people of colors, have acquired new type of protagonism, like the young people had in the Fridays for Future and other environmental forms of protest. This is not just the case of the Black Lives Matter that stimulate connections between the environmental movements and the other movements, but it is also the case of another progressive social movements we analyzed in this period, called the Society of Care. And it is a movement that tried to create convergence around the ideas of free access to vaccines all over the world. And this is also an important element of the transformations in the frames of the environmental movements, because the pandemic brought about, as more and more central, the idea that caring for nature means also caring for equality and justice. And this is also, testified by the ways in which Societies for Care was able to connect movements that went from the Occupy Wall Street to the feminist movements, to Black Lives Matters, but also the Fridays for Future. So this, as far as the opportunities are concerned. I want to finish these presentations by reflecting also on the challenges with illustrations from another research that I've undertaken during the pandemics, and which have addressed the anti-vax forms of protest, which I take and interpret as a movement that developed upon some characteristics of the radical right populism, but also some networks of the radical right, and adopting frames that are deeply influenced by conspiratorial theory, the ideas of conspiracies, but also adopting forms of actions that have been at times extremely violent, with anti-vax protest in Germany, with the paving the way for the assault to the Capitol in the United States. So violent forms of actions that are based on conspirational theories, and that's built upon some of the main elements of populism, among which a strong mistrust for science, but also in general a strong mistrust for solidarity and citizenship, and the convergence on very individualistic type of frames. So in the anti-vax movement, I think one could single out the effects of different challenges developing in the pandemics, from increasing inequalities and social fragmentation faced with the virus, to scapegoating, to the closing of political opportunities during emergency time. The protests were very different, while among others, from the generational point of view, while the progressive sides mobilized young people, the no-vax protests tended to mobilize especially small groups of middle-aged people, with events focusing especially in reactions to measures taken to reduce contagion, and with very limited capacity when we look at the organizations of the protest events, for the activists to mobilize the social groups that were more hit by the pandemic itself, and instead focalizations on actors from the radical right, on the one hand, which were quite visible, especially in the first phase, and very linked to them, Novax and groups very much related that mobilized against the vaccination certificate. In the evolutions of the forms of actions, what emerges also as a different with the progressive movements is the use of violent actions. That was also related on the one hand to the symbolic refusal to comply with the rules related with the pandemic, but also very often with visions of the citizens and the elite as very related with a populist type of framing, with powerful plot by a small elite, and the citizens being more or less subjects to this strength, to these strong actors. In these visions, like in populist visions, the unvaccinated are presented as heroes that are going to save the humanities. So a sort of narrative trend that is also quite visible in the radical right in general, the presentations of the self as at the same time victims of a conspiracy, and small minorities that can testify for the resistance to it. Very strong type of individualistic frames with individual freedom taken as the most important claims against also any visions of solidarity. The associations with persecuted people, with something that has been also very much stigmatized, the use of symbols of the persecutions of the Jews in order to present themselves as victims of persecution. So the unvaccinated, as Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben that embraced the movement suggested, as the victims of suspensions of rights. And the concept of a sanitary dictatorship that is the one against which the minority of heroes should be mobilized. Within conspiratorial ideas that build upon very much the QAnon conspiracy, and so connect the movements with the most developed radical right type of conspiratorial thinking, and the strong criticism of science in general that also represents deep differences. If we think about instead the environmental justice movement that put science as at the center of a resistance to climate change. So the global, like in populism, this is also connected with an idea of defending national sovereignty against the global elites that are claimed to support a great reset and wanted to subject citizens to a sort of deep control. So that's nationalist flags are very much presented, together with the violence of the radical right. This pictures is one of the most violent forms of anti-vax protest in Italy, led by the radical right, and is the assault to the headquarters of the main Italian trade unions. So global elite and nationalism, and now moving towards some conclusions. Times of pandemic could be read, in my view, referring to sociological theories that stress the particular characteristics of intense time. So times of what sociologists of the neo-institutionalist approach have called critical junctures. So times in which the crisis produce transformations that are not gradual, as it happens in normal times, but that happen in an accelerated way, subject to the continuous interlocking of different types of crises. There are times characterized as times of emergency, in which also the normal rules and normal practices tend to not to work and to be subject to sudden challenges. This is in times of pandemic, all the more so as pandemic are related with contagious diseases that produces per se also particular forms of scapegoating on different groups, among which are the migrants and minority groups in the populations. At the same time, these times of pandemics are also eventful time. An historian, William Sewell, has pointed at the characteristics of some moments in history in which events are stronger than context. Events are stronger than structures. Democratization processes are one of these. For instance, the transitions to democracy in Eastern Europe in 1989 has been considered as a typical moment of eventful temporality in which the impossible became true and in which suddenly people mobilized, changing not only the ways in which they saw reality, but their own type of identities. They transformed themselves in actions. And these special times are also times in which eventful protest happens. So protests of different types are able to increase in terms of number, like in the case of the Black Lives Matter, and broaden their scope, their capacity to involve groups of citizens. So pandemic times can be considered as emergency critical junctures. It's an abnormal event. So the pandemic challenges the assumption of predictability, stability, and structurations on which much theorizations in social and political science is based. It is critical junctures also in the sense that it weakens the power of existing structures and pushes towards decisions that go beyond the routines. They are times in which the importance of the agency is increased over the constraining power of structures. And finally, these are times of high uncertainty, So movements themselves cannot be built on solid type of routines, but rather needs to adapt to the fast pace of the events and face to unfamiliar type of circumstances. So these are moments in which, in Gramsci's terms, the old is dead, but the new is not yet able to be born. And so there are times of high uncertainty, times of potential changes, but also times in which the can we say the final outcome is not predictable, because many different actors mobilize on the progressive and on the regressive side. So emergencies in this sense are challenges, but are also opportunities. So they are crises, which, as sociologists Flingston and McAdam has pointed at, prompt the attributions of different opportunities and threats. And so challenge the existing structures and create opportunities for engaging in innovative, contentious interactions in different type of fields. And there are times of eventful protest, like the Black Lives Matter, but also the Fridays for Future and the other movements, in which triggers, events, small, relatively small type of protest are able to be quickly reproduced in time and space, and sustain the mobilizations in terms of both creations of prefigurative policies and effects that mobilizations can have on public policies. The perceptions of time accelerate, and what seemed impossible appears now possible. So I want to conclude stressing the fact that after the pandemic crisis that may be almost over, movements, populism and progressive movements are now under new challenges. The military tension in this moment are also interacting with the previous crisis. And so there is ground to look at both opportunities and challenges, but also there is an important concerns with the actions, because it is mentioned a moment of changes in which, for those within representative institutions as for the citizens outside, actions requires innovations and transformations, and the struggles within countries and at the international level between progressive and regressive forces, between social justice and populism, is more and more strong, and the end results open. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope the connection was good, and sorry again for not having been able to be there.
Okay, Renata, thank you very much for your very interesting and kind of wholesale overview of challenges for not just progressive movements in these years. And now I will use this time to open the debate. And I already see the first question is from Daniele Albertazzi. So please go ahead.
Thank you for that. Can you hear me? Thank you for that presentation, which was fascinating. I just have, I would like to pick on your brains on something that is kind of bothering me.
I cannot hear.
Oh, you can't hear you? Can you hear me now? No? Can you hear me now? 1, 2, 3. Microphone check? No? She's muted. Fine. 1. Can you hear me? No? She's not frozen. Can you hear with this one? Can you hear me? Oh, you can. Oh, great.
Now I can hear, yes.
Oh, thank you. So, Daniele Bertazzi, University of Surrey, I wanted to pick on your brains on a topic that has been bothering me for a while, and it's this. Had you told me when I was a teenager, starting to get interested in politics, that following the rules, wearing a mask, getting vaccinated, believing in that climate change is man-made, were left-wing positions, while being obsessed with the power of the state to keep an eye on us, not wearing a mask, not getting vaccinated, and refusing to accept that climate change is man-made, I wouldn't have rejected it. I just would not have understood it. Had you told me something like this, and I mean, there are a lot of data now that shows that it's precisely like this. I mean, if you are, especially if you are radical right, you are more likely to think that the whole palaver of restrictions because of COVID, it's something that is due to the state wanting to acquire more power over us and control us, and you're more likely to reject the idea that climate change is man-made, and so on and so forth. And you touched on this, of course, in part of your presentation. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, I know we are here now, that's where we are, but how did we get here? How did we get to a point in which the meaning of left and right has changed so fundamentally and so quickly?
Yes, thank you. I think the answer is connected also with some ongoing research exactly on how populism reacted to the pandemic. And both Mude and Stravakakis have, based on empirical research, pointed at the different ways in which the radical rights in government, but also in the oppositions, has addressed the pandemic, with, however, some similar trends among some of the main example of radical right populist in power, from Trump to Bolsonaro. The idea of the pandemic as a hoax is widespread. They also invited people not to wear masks and not to respect social distances. In this, I think, how do we explain this? On the one hand, conspiratorial thinking is very widespread on the radical right. In fact, the anti-vax positions was embraced by Trump far before the pandemic. We've been supporters of anti-vax movement in the past, and this has been also related with skeptical positions on science, skeptical positions, which is relevant to mention now, given the topic of the conference on climate change. So it is a broad mistrust in science that has been defined by some scholars as scientific populism. And this is what I also wanted to point at with the pictures in which the activists said il medico sono io. The medical doctors is myself. So these ideas of yes, the refusal of science and the sort of trust in natural law. That during the pandemic has been also supported by some conservative groups within the different churches. This was particularly strong in the Orthodox Church, in countries such as Greece, Cyprus, or Romania, in which also the idea was that vaccines were an instrument of the state, while the protections had to come from God. Another element to cite, which had an influence in the development of the anti-vax protest, is the specific type of QAnon conspiracy, which merges together different type of conspiracies frames that are widespread since centuries, with the politizations on the right. So with the idea that Trump and radical right populists will save the world against the progressive groups that are drinking the blood of the children and so on. This was quite widespread in several groups, especially in the forms of a conspiracy against what was called the Great Reset, sort of capitalist plot of the global elites. And here as well, I think that there was a resonance with the positions of some radical right groups that's taking the example of Italy, Forza Nuova, which were already very sensitive or very strongly believed in this type of conspiracy. And what was also an element which I think connected this anti-vax with the radical right is the mobilizations of anti-globalist frame. So the vaccine was considered as a global serum, was named, that's attacked potentials for defense of the different countries. So this, I think, could explain why on the radical right, rather than obedience to law and order, there was to the opposite the use of the challenges of rules and regulation. What is more puzzling and was not expected, but is something that emerges also from the research, is that QAnon theories and radical right politizations of conspiracies also developed in an exoteric environment, which had emerged from alternative conceptions of medicines and so on, that was split during the pandemic, so not all of those believing in homeopathy or alternative medicines took conspiracy theories, but some of them, and the ways in which these more right-wing politicized conspiracies have penetrated in this other environment has been studied also in Germany, where the puzzling evidence was that the anti-vax movement had two regions as core regions. One was the eastern regions in which the Alternative für Deutschland was leading the movement. And the other one was in southern Germany, where exoteric alternative milieux have been particularly strong. and the convergence was in a narrative against the state, which I think can be explained especially by the penetration in the European rights of some of the frames, radical right frames that are more typical for the American radical rights, and more typical especially in the alt-right, in the Bannon type of groups and so on. So this is the reason.
Okay, thank you. Another question, if there's one. Somebody? Okay, just a couple of more seconds if you would like. I know it's like, it's like long time already. Okay, so if there's no question, I don't know, Nathan, if you can hear me. Probably I will use the. Okay, I will use a question myself. I would like to ask you if there is a. If there is a connection between, you mentioned this support for this radical kind of anti-vaxxers. The same mic as you? It's mute. You can hear me?
A bit.
Yeah, I will try to shout. I wanted to ask you if there is a connection, according to you, or your opinion, between a support for like populist parties and populist movements and these anti-vaxxers. If there's like a connection, if you observed in this COVID age some kind of that these groups were like cooperating or were used by populist parties and populist movements to their like gain, or like cooperating in the electoral process and that.
Thank you. I couldn't hear well. Maybe with the other microphone you can summarize the question.
I will try. Do you hear me?
I'm sorry.
Do you hear me?
Now you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
Now yes. Sorry, yes, now yes.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. I think we will end. Unfortunately, we have a slight technical issue. Fortunately, just at the end of the transmission. So I don't know if Donata hear us, but if you can hear us at least some way, just thank you very much for being with us, at least in this improvised condition, and thank you for your time, and maybe next time or in person in here with us in Prague. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much to you, and hope to be there the next time.
Okay, so this was the end of the keynote. We still have now a break in which you can have you can spend with a coffee there, and we will meet for the last part of the day at 6. Yes. At 6 o'clock in here. And just please, before you will come and sit down, please take the interpretation device, because part of the debate will be in Czech language and translated. So those who will be in here, just take it with you before the start of the event. Thank you.